Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
In July 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the first humans to land on the moon. In May 2020, in response to COVID-19, the US federal government initiated Operation Warp Speed to accelerate the development and distribution of vaccines and cut what would otherwise be a 10-year timeline to within a span of 1 year. In 1989, the Montreal Protocol was set in place to phase out the production of substances responsible for ozone depletion. What's common among these programs? I'm Shreya Ramakrishnan, and I'm joined by Arindam Goswamy on this podcast conversation. Hi, Arindam.
Hey Shreya, hi. Good to be back on this podcast and a very interesting topic that we have at hand. Looking forward to the discussion. Yeah.
So, Arindam, it's so compelling to think about big social challenges around us as missions, right? That are just waiting to be addressed and thereby changing the reality of that problem completely and bringing in a lot of innovation and change in those areas and allied areas in the process. I'm half expecting you to bring me down to earth by the end of this podcast. So, in these well-known programs and even in similar programs like this, right, what are some characteristics that stand out for you?
Yeah. So as you said, right, there should be some specific characteristics that would designate some activity that we do as a mission mode activity, right? We tend to call almost all programs missions nowadays, right? I mean, right from, say, the National Rural Health Mission to National Urban Health Mission. So everything's called a mission nowadays, and that sort of then dilutes the importance of a mission, right? And you don't really get work done on a mission mode there. So mission typically should have a specific meaning, and there could be like various characteristics by which we could define missions. There have been papers written on it, but in general it's quite intuitive also. If we look at mission mode projects, like as you mentioned, the space program that the US did in response to Russia and the whole Sputnik thing, right? Even before that, the Manhattan Project was a mission that was initiated to develop the nuclear weapon before Nazi Germany could do it, right? So that sort of gives us an idea in about what characteristics make a problem, a social problem, amenable to an innovation mission, right? So, or not only innovation mission, but you could also have missions for other things like infrastructure, health, education, right? So we could have mission mode projects in a variety of ways. There are a few characteristics that really stand out, right? The project should be of national importance, right? It should be large scale. It should have maybe some security implications or maybe some very urgent health implications, right? So something of that sort, right? So you mentioned Operation Warp Speed, right? And that was, as you said, undertaken to provide or develop and administer 300 million doses of the COVID-19 vaccine. And this was taken up when we didn't have a COVID-19 vaccine as such, right? So, the typical time taken for developing a vaccine is probably 10 years, right? 7 to 10 years. And that was to be reduced to less than a year, right? Maybe 10 months or so. So to do that sort of large scale program, you require it to be a problem of national importance, right? So there were forecasts that the United States would probably suffer, I think, some $16 trillion of harm from like combined mortality, morbidity, and economic output, right? And that was like $26 billion of losses each day. So that was a huge nationally important project, right? So that is one characteristic. Then the problem at hand should be very time sensitive, right? So in case
lots of urgency
that's required, right? So there was no point in developing the nuclear weapon after maybe Nazi Germany had developed it and used it, right? So that sort of a time urgency is required. There's no point in developing a COVID-19 vaccine too late when like millions of people have already died, right? So there's some time sensitivity there, right? So that also points us to one characteristic of a social problem.
There's also a lot of ambition here. Like these are very ambitious, almost impossible sounding programs. Would you agree?
Yes. So these are like long shots, right? I mean, you need to think of programs which, in the normal course of work or life, right, you will not probably undertake. And I mean, we could have. I mean, there are quite a few long shot programs which probably would not qualify for a mission, right? So, for example, the mortality of other diseases is probably higher than that for COVID-19, right? But because COVID-19 was highly contagious, and it required lockdowns, which then affected
Right.
the economy and lives, right? So that sense of urgency is there, right? So it's not just mortality, right? In case of health-related mission programs, it's not necessarily just mortality that qualifies a program to be a mission, right? It also has to be some other factors, right? The monetary value of, if we can put a monetary value to the losses, right? So those sorts of things also come into play. It's not just a long shot program that needs to be. So, for example, developing the semiconductor ecosystem in India, right? Now that's a long shot program probably, or an objective, because we sort of, other than maybe in the design phase, we don't have a lot of talent or a lot of manufacturing capabilities in the other aspects, right? So to develop that is a long shot, but is it nationally important at this point? Probably yes, from a geopolitical perspective. But is it very urgent? Yes, we could say it's urgent because we have that opportunity now, right? If we don't capitalize on it, then probably some other nations would capitalize on that and march ahead of us in this particular value chain, right? So it has to be a long shot, but it also has to be urgent enough. It has to be time sensitive, and all those other characteristics also come into picture. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, there seems to be like a strong connect between what is proposed and the existing values of that time. So, among citizens and among, the polity, there seems to be a common understanding of, yes, this is a good idea, and yes, we need to do this.
Yes. So in this regard, there's an important concept called creative insecurity, right? That Mark Zachary Taylor had proposed, right? So he talks about he defines creative insecurity as external hazards or external threats overshadowing domestic problems, right? So when such a thing happens, it's very easy to coalesce all the domestic interests together in pursuit of a national mission, right? So that's what happened in the 1960s. There was a Cold War that sort of spurred the defense sector, the space sector, and all of those other technologies, which then gave us benefits in other fields also, right? Similarly, with the Manhattan Project, then maybe India's nuclear program also could be something of that sort, right? We required the technology, but we were not getting it from other countries because of various sanctions and all those other problems. So, and we sort of developed it, maybe not in a truly mission mode sort of way, but there was some urgency there. Right? There was a reason why the domestic interests also aligned, and we were able to get that done. Yeah.
Right.
And
Yeah.
another point is, you mentioned that this is a long shot, right? So long shot programs, by their definition, would be huge, large scale, would
Time
span across
consuming, huh?
departments, time consuming. It would span across different departments, different government departments, private sector, right? So it requires uncommon coordination, right? And for that, you require different sorts of management structures, different sorts of
Right.
coordination structures. So the run of the mill bureaucracy would not work there. You would require
Exactly.
an integrated command structure with the responsibility plus the authority to carry out the activity. So that was also something that is common in these missions that you mentioned. There was a Manhattan Project, then there's Operation Warp Speed, and so on, right? So yeah.
Right. This is a common characteristic and rather unique in that it's just a small time frame. You have all of these multiple agencies to sort of work together
Right.
and collaborate on this new activity that hasn't been done. It's completely novel, and this is pretty unique in that sense.
Yes. And there's another characteristic that we can probably look at of such problems is it requires a lot of funding, right? It requires humongous amount of funding, right? And the commercial markets are generally inadequate to finance those, right? So private sector by and itself will probably not be able to finance it, and that's because of different concepts from public policy, right? So there are positive externalities to some activities, right? Say vaccine development, right? It has huge positive externalities, right? But those positive externalities are probably not something that the private sector can visualize effectively in terms of, because they are motivated by profits,
Of
and
course.
that's obviously nothing wrong in that, but because of that they are not able to look at it in terms of the costs that the society has to bear if, say, the COVID-19 vaccine is not
Right.
developed in time, right? So if those sorts of problems are there in the commercial market, then all of us need to step together, step up, and come together, think of innovative ways of funding it. There's different ways of funding it. You either fund a upfront expense, or you give pledges to buy the final product, irrespective of what the process is. You say at the end, if you're able to produce the vaccine, we'll buy it. We will buy
Right.
this specific quantity of, say, vaccines, and that gives some sort of security to the private sector entities to go ahead with that activity, right? So the funding is something that is
Would
very,
you say it's one of the main things?
yes, it's one of the most necessary conditions, right? Without funding, no sort of mission mode program will probably succeed, right? It would fail. I mean, even in the case of Operation Warp Speed, it ran into billions of dollars, right? I mean, tens of billions of dollars, multiples of tens of billions of dollars, right? So that sort of funding, if it's not available, it's going to be difficult to sustain a mission mode program. Yeah.
Right. So, funding, as we've discussed, is one of the main criteria that's needed for something like this to fall in place.
Right.
What else can we add to this list? Like, there's extensive coordination that's required,
Yes.
right, between all of these parties and agencies.
Right. So let's take the example of Operation Warp Speed only that you mentioned, right? So over there, if you've seen the command structure consisted of a scientist who was like sort of leading the program, and there was also a chief operation officer sort of person who was from the army or the armed
Right.
forces, right? And generally, that's what's observed in the missions that we see from the US, for example. Even in the Manhattan Project, we had that sort of a leadership structure, and these command structures are sort of authorized to carry out a lot of the tasks that are entailed within that mission, right? And not just carry out the task, but also get others to carry out those tasks, right? But it's not just having the authority, right? You require different departments to come together, right? Say, for example, in the case of Operation Warp Speed, if you needed to develop the vaccine, you required the health department to coordinate the clinical trials, see how those could be done parallelly instead of
Right.
sequentially. How could you develop the production capacities of the private sector in parallel and in time for producing the vaccines by the time clinical trials get over, right? So you can't really wait for the clinical trials to get over
Right.
and the vaccine to be approved to start building the production capacity, right? So that requires a lot of coordination between the industry and maybe the Department of Commerce, Department of Industry, and those sorts of
Right.
departments, right? You also require maybe somebody to look at the supply chain constraints, right? So all of these activities will require people from different parts of the country, different industries to coordinate to have a robust supply chain that doesn't break down. So maybe some department to look at that, right? And when you require so much of coordination, it helps to have an integrated command structure at the top, which coordinates. So in case of, say, program infrastructure programs in India, for example, right, we quite often see the PMO, for example, holding all these review meetings, looking at different programs and see where they are stuck, right? And then try to get things moving,
Right.
fix those issues, right? So that sort of command structure is always required if you want to iron out the chinks and get the programs out. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just fascinating because while we were talking about coordination, I also got the sense that you need a lot of really active engagement
Hmm.
between all of these parties to engage with the problem in hand and do a lot of experimentation, real time. It all sounds very non-linear in approach.
Yeah.
And so there's autonomy and authority. And that's an interesting mix to see in a highly timed project.
Yeah. It's very difficult to achieve that sort of coordination, right? When you're doing things in a non-linear fashion, you're doing things parallel instead of sequential, right? It's very difficult to coordinate these things, and you require obviously to provide autonomy to the people and the organizations involved, but also a lot of coordination is required amongst them. Yeah.
It looks like that's what really reiterates the fact that this is a mission oriented approach or a program as opposed to a more long term
Yeah.
approach. The fact that you're more focused on the end goal and meeting those requirements, and so you're willing to take all of these extra steps.
Yes, yes. And what helps in doing that effectively is having a very well-defined goal, right? If it's say an innovation mission, if it's say a mission like Manhattan Project or the Operation Warp Speed for the COVID-19 vaccine, it helped that we had a very well-defined technological goal, right?
Right.
Even within the COVID-19 vaccine program that we had, there are different strains of the virus, right? And we obviously couldn't account for all of those strains, right? And there's obviously the knowledge that viruses would mutate and all of that, right? So you can't really build a vaccine that is effective. You can't really wait to build a vaccine that's
Right.
effective against all sorts of strains. So a conscious call was taken to build it against maybe a particular strain, but something that would solve maybe a major part of the problem, right? And then look at it incrementally. Say if you want to build booster doses and those sorts of things, right? So having that sort of a well-defined goal is very important. Even in say if you leave aside innovation missions, if there's say an infrastructure mission, right? If you have very well-defined goals that we need to build, for example, say when we built the Golden Quadrilateral, that was maybe a well-defined mission. Right now, we are building expressways, right? But if we have a proper well-defined goal of why do we want to build it, which areas we want to build it, how does it align with, say, an industrial corridor and those sorts of aspects, if we have clarity on that, then it helps. Otherwise, it will peter out somewhere down the line, right? And you'll not have proper clarity. People within need to have that clarity. Yeah.
Absolutely. The gaps will sort of take over and you can't move as fast.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
There was also something else I wanted to add,
Mhm.
but I missed that right now. I'll come back to that. So, Arindam, programs like this will also require a lot of market collaboration and even outside of that, just shaping the market, right, through regulations and laws required for that goal to be achieved.
Right, right, right. There have been interesting papers on this also. Maybe we can link it in the show notes or something. But as you mentioned, quite a few of these technological missions that we have sometimes lose sight of maybe the social impact of the programs, or even in case of climate change, climate funding, right, climate technology. Are they really looking at the social aspect? Are they doing enough for, say, combating the climate change problem that we have? So if we can shape the market, there are concepts of using industrial policy to shape the market instead of just
Right,
ironing out the market failures. Instead of that,
right.
actively shaping the market towards these goals, right? Towards the environmental, social, and other goals that we have, right? So
This will involve a lot of behavior change interventions over a period of time for it to work.
yes, yes, it requires a change in the thinking around these missions, right? So, and then if we have that sort of thinking, we'll also reevaluate what sort of missions we opt for, right? So, health, for example, is something that requires a lot of focus, right? We require obviously to firm up our defenses and other aspects of a nation's life, but unless you have a healthy population and in a country where, say, for example, we still have people under malnutrition and those sorts of problems we still have, right?
Right,
We need to have missions centered around those problems also. And some of them may be amenable to a mission mode program, but if not, even a 3 to 5 year sort of program to tackle these issues is something that we need to seriously look at. Yeah.
right.
That aspect of social welfare also can be brought into a mission, right? So we have those sorts of missions. We have the health missions and all of those, right? But
We do.
are they really being done in a mission mode, proper mission mode? Do they have a proper mission mode design, right? Otherwise, we are just naming them as missions, but do they have the requisite authority? Do they have the requisite coordination? For example, National Rural Health Mission requires coordination across states, across at the lowest level of, say, a Panchayati Raj institution, right? Do we have those sorts of things ironed out? Do we have those sorts of things properly defined, right? So that's important. Public finances, right? If you want to have a local level mission, say if we can think of a mission at the very basic unit of governance. Say in Bangalore, right? If you ask somebody what's the problem, it's what's one of the main problems that you face. Maybe it's water supply or
Transport.
It could be roads, right? And the bad condition of roads, right? Apart from the problem of traffic, it's also the condition of the roads, right? So maybe there's I don't know if you're trivializing a mission, but
We're saying there are a lot of takeaways
yeah. So
from
there's a lot of takeaways from how missions are designed to extrapolate that to programs, say, to just improve the roads or to just improve the infrastructure at the city level, right? So it'll require coordination across different departments, different wards in the city. Financing, right? We know that public finances in India are skewed towards the top, right, towards the center, and then
Right.
we don't have a lot of financial autonomy and wherewithal at the lower level. So how does that funding come through? We need to think of that. We need to think of having very focused activities, right?
There's a directionality in these kinds of mission programs that is really attractive to carry out everywhere else as well.
Yes. And there's so much to do at the local level that we can look at design features from these national mission mode programs and see how we can pull them into local level projects also. Yeah.
It also invites a lot of collaboration,
Yeah.
very robust, healthy level of collaborative experimentation among markets and governments and society,
Yes.
which is what you need to solve some of these really big problems we have today, whether it's health or hunger or food or water even.
Yep. And one of, say, for example, what could we take away? So we mentioned funding, we mentioned uncommon coordination, but we also require, for example, new ways of contracting out, right? So say during the Operation Warp Speed, right, they didn't use the normal ways of contracting out work, right? They used something called, I think, the Other Transaction Authority,
I
OTAs,
see.
right? So to create to have those sorts of purchase agreements, because that sort of gives a leeway to the purchaser in terms of what sort of, does he have to give out tenders, does he have to do bidding and all of those things, right? Does he need to have auctions and all of those things? So
that process is
circumvented, but in a way that's necessary at that point,
right.
and gives a lot of leeway to the person and leaves it to his probably discretion and trusts him, right? But do we have those mechanisms in India? For example, can we assure those people that if they are carrying out those activities in good faith with good intentions, then they won't be hounded later on by, say, a governmental inquiry or a CAG inquiry, or
Right.
so we need those sorts of things put into our laws, put into our rules and guidelines, so that people have the means to innovate in their work, right? Not innovate in a science and technology sort of way, but in terms of processes.
Experiment.
Yeah, are they allowed to do that, right, without any repercussions for good faith activities, right? So for example, in the projects that, say, for example, NASA contracts out, right, for few of the projects, if you can demonstrate that good faith efforts have been made, then irrespective of whether, even if say the project has not completed, you're not penalized as such, right? So that sort of jurisprudence also needs to be developed in India, so that these things can be done in a fashion that people have the requisite leeway to experiment without the fear of being hounded for it later on.
That's fascinating and so important, right? To have that sort of playground you can operate in.
Right.
And so the question really is, if we're willing to do all of these things that it takes to sort of make a program more mission focused, time bound, urgent, and more movement focused. And a lot of these missions also are very strategic in nature.
Yeah.
That's something I also appreciate about them. And I think we can take some of that and apply it to programs that are essential to start out right away. I mean, social problems.
Yeah. So there are social problems. Then, as you mentioned, strategic problems, right? In the current geopolitical conditions that we have, right? There's quite a few areas that are strategically evolving as newer frontiers that need to be protected. The semiconductor, GVCs, global value chains. Then there is probably critical and emerging technologies. So do we want to do a few things? So the governments from time to time do start some or the other mission in these areas, right? But do we have the required funding? What happens to them? Do they actually proceed, right? For example, we have the NRF, right, that was recently announced to carry on research, right? The expectation is that it'll be something along the lines of maybe DARPA or something, right? But does it really have are we seeing activity on that, right? We are not really
Can you
seeing.
give a couple of lines explaining that for our listeners who may not know?
So the Anusandhan National Research Foundation that we recently announced, right? So it sort of is supposed to give a spur to innovation and research and development in India. But from the initial looks of it, it seems like the same wine, in a new bottle, right? So, in fact, it does subsume previous organization that we had called SERB, I think Science and Education Research Board or something of that sort.
Right.
But it just subsumes that, it gives it a new name. It has announced a huge amount for funding, which is not really very huge, but looks huge, 50,000 crores over 5 years. But then again, there's no clarity around how that funding will be achieved. It says, like, I guess 30% or something will come from central government and the rest from either private sector or state. But
Right.
how does it come about? What sort of projects will be picked up under NRF? Unless we have that goal of this organization defined, we are in fact not seeing a lot of activity on it. The board and the command structure as such, organization structure, was recently announced in a notification. But other than that, we are not seeing a lot of activity on that front. So that's one way in which these missions will
Clarity.
these will fail, right? I mean, unless you have that clarity, unless you have the funding defined, unless you have these things populated by the proper personnel, right? You can't have just bureaucrats and politicians involved in such thing. You require it to be helmed by maybe scientists or technologists or experts, right? And unless you have that clarity in the command structure, in the organizational structure, it'll also fail. So that's maybe one more takeaway. Yeah,
Right.
one more thing that we missed in the design of such mission mode things, right? So generally, when you are up against against time pressure, right, that you have to develop something maybe in 10 months, right? You can't really put your eggs in just one basket, right? You need to choose different approaches also, right? So that's what we did in the COVID-19 vaccine program, also Operation Warp Speed. I think the US government chose three sort of platform types, delivery types, and even within those platform types, they chose two vaccines to be developed, right, from different companies. And there's an inherent fear of failure in this, right? So you have three platform types. Even if one platform type fails, then those two vaccines are going to fail. So the investment
Right.
in that, the production capacity that's being built up, all of that is a wasteful expenditure in hindsight, right? But statistically also, mathematically also, if you look at it, it's better to invest in multiple approaches. And even if that approach, for example, involves taking up an approach which, as a standalone thing, might have lesser probability of success than the other approaches, right? But mathematically, it sort of, as a whole, gives you much higher probability of success. So that's the reason why, probably, when you look at mission mode projects, you have to look at what all approaches do you take in that mission, right? Do you focus on just one way of doing things, or do you have the financial wherewithal to invest in different approaches, right? And if you're going to invest in different approaches, are you ready to bear the fact that some of them might fail, and then that will be considered a wasteful expenditure? Does it help in the political economy, in the political conditions of the country? Does that work, right? So that sort of aspect also comes in, right? So at the end, when we say domestic interests, it involves the political aspect also, right? Are all those aligned, right? Do we have the Overton window? Has it shifted to accommodate this sort of
Right.
way of doing things, right? So I mean, if we are not able to even think of, say, for example, different ways of auctioning or giving away natural resources, if you are hell-bent on saying just like spectrum auctioning is the best way of auctioning spectrum, right? If that's how rigid we can sometimes become, then we are not really considering different approaches, right, to doing things. Obviously, there has to be logic, science, reason, maths backing all of this.
But it's so counterintuitive. Everything you've been saying in the last 3 minutes have been so counterintuitive.
I mean, it sounds counterintuitive, but it's backed by maths, right? For example, choosing different approaches. It's statistically better to have different approaches than choose. Say, if you rank approaches based on the standalone success probabilities, you'll probably think, oh, let's pick up the first three, and I'll have higher success probability. But what if there's failure in those approaches? Then what's the success probability for the whole program, right? And when
Right.
you're designing a program, you need to look at the success probability for the whole program.
Right.
Similarly, when you're sort of distributing the natural resources of the country, what's most efficient, right? And not just in terms of standard probability, but if you look at the entire program, that we have to do say spectrum distribution, then what's the best way of doing it, right? We should not offend, reject ways of doing it, like even first come first serve, right? But you have in place adequate safeguards, but not make good faith efforts look bad, right? So that's
Right.
what I want to really say. Yeah.
Yeah, this has been such a fascinating sort of explainer about how these kinds of programs work. We've looked at some characteristics of programs such as these. We've seen what it takes for a program like this to gain traction, and those also happen to be the features that distinguish them. And then later, we've also seen some takeaways for other long term programs that can bring into them for better results.
Right. Yeah.
But this is also something to keep in mind for us when we also sort of have those moments of wishful thinking of why don't we just get this done,
Yeah.
or why don't we just do this one thing, to sort of also keep in mind that these are all the different sort of very non-linear counterintuitive decisions that you need to take and hard calls that you absolutely have to take in
Right.
multiple parties to make this happen.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So while it sounds very good to say, okay, let's do it in a mission mode thing and let's get it over in a year and we solve all the problems in the world, right? But it doesn't really happen that way. Public funding, for example, is limited. If the government is going to fund it, it doesn't have unlimited resources, right? So it needs to prioritize. So you ask any department, it will say, oh yeah, we want to do it in a mission mode way. You ask the space department, yeah, we want to go to Mars, maybe we want to go to some other,
Right.
right? If you ask, say, the defense sector, yes, we want to develop newer technologies, newer weapons, and all of that, right? So we can't satisfy everything. We have to prioritize it, and while doing that, maybe these features, these characteristics that we described, help to narrow down what really we should tackle, right? Say if one of the characteristics is national importance and urgency, then maybe that gives us a way to prioritize our activities, and it also recognizes the fact that governments alone cannot do things, right? You
Absolutely.
require participation of all sections of the society, and to do that you require command structures. So one thing to consider is, do we have the state capacity, this capacity of the state machinery to lead these things, right? If not, then do we look at some other mechanisms, something that's led maybe by the private sector, but the government is an enabling role. So these are things to ponder about. We can't fit one way of thinking like, okay, let's go for mission mode. That will probably not help everywhere. So for example, the clinical trials that were fast tracked, right? It may not be correct. I'm not expert in that, but maybe it would not be correct to always circumvent or change those
Right.
processes, right? Also, mission mode projects by inherently wouldn't have the energy to sustain beyond a
Yeah.
period of time.
Right.
You can't have people working in that strong, focused, high energy sort of way for maybe more than 10 months, 1 year or so, right? People would get burnt out.
Burnout is eventual.
Yeah, and public interest would also peter out. And then if public interest peters out, then political interest peters out, right? So
Oh, wow.
those
Yes.
are the things. So you can't have something being run in a mission mode for 5 years or 10 years, right? I mean, it will not sustain. Politically, governments, the party itself might change in power, right? And what could be their pet project is probably not going to be given the same amount of interest by the other government that comes in, right? So all of these aspects also come in when you decide. Something like COVID is probably the best example of where everything just aligns, right? And
Right.
even if you're in the party, if you're in the government or you're in opposition, you want to solve the problem, right? So that's probably one of the best examples of a mission mode project, or even maybe the Manhattan project, right? Although there were probably, I assume, opponents of that too, because it's nuclear weaponry, right?
Right.
So, but COVID-19 probably, I don't think, unless it's the anti-vaxxers, right? Otherwise, I don't think there would be people who would,
Yes.
oppose that. Yeah.
Right. So, in conclusion, I think we are in agreement that not all programs can qualify for like a mission style execution just because you can't sustain it, and basically everything that you just said. But the approach and characteristics of what qualifies these programs and what it takes to implement some of these programs, I think, have value in bringing in at specific cases and a case to case basis and in small areas in larger long term planned projects.
Yeah. I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done in identifying the characteristics of these problems, right? I mean, there have been papers which have maybe defined 5 characteristics, 6 characteristics, but
Right.
there probably, if there's a social sort of aspect to any problem, right? It's not just a health problem, right? Sometimes there are social aspects that come into the picture. Marginalized people, disadvantaged sections of a society probably have problems of a different nature. So when you're designing maybe a health mission, probably you'll have to consider those aspects, right? So what we discuss is obviously not an exhaustive list of characteristics or design features. More research is probably required for different sorts of missions.
Thank you so much, Arindam, for this very insightful talk. I hope this was valuable to our listeners as well.
Thanks, Shreya. I love the discussion, and I hope our listeners also enjoyed it, and would love to hear their feedback on this. Yeah.
See you all next time.
See you. Bye.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaInst or our website takshashila.org.in.